Yesterday, I had the privilege of celebrating another wedding. In my 11 years of priesthood, I have officiated at over 200 weddings by now, probably closer to 300. So it makes about 500 people that I had the honor of putting together, forever, hopefully. And every time I have this wonderful privilege of officiating at a wedding ceremony, I'm thinking to myself, gosh, the very fact that someone is getting married today gives me hope for a better tomorrow. Now, if someone is willing and is crazy and courageous enough to commit to that person for the rest of their lives, there is goodness in the world. There is hope in the world. Things are not lost yet. When I meet with the couples prior to their wedding, one of the questions is if they live together yet. And of course, 99% of times they say yes. And honestly, I think it's somewhat of a good thing, because it is better to find out the flaws of your spouse-to-be before you say I do than afterwards. It makes more sense to realize that your sweet, perfect angel is not so sweet and perfect 24/7. That even she or he has his or her shortcomings once in a while. And so it makes sense today, in the 21st century, that you do get to know your spouse-to-be before getting married. That you get over that oh and ah stage when nothing she says or does can be wrong, and you get to that realistic stage when you say to yourself, okay, despite him driving me crazy, I still want to be his wife. Despite her having only one flaw, I still want to be her husband. It's a very reaffirming moment when you get over that initial infatuation stage and you keep finding out his or her shortcomings or flaws, and yet you say to yourself, he did, she did grab my heart, and that moment when I was totally crazily in love with him, with her, makes everything worthwhile. That moment when he or she made me realize that my life is better makes me forego that one or two or five flaws of his or hers. Today's gospel passage gives us a sample of one person realizing that Jesus ain't perfect. Now, we think of Jesus as someone who would never break any law, someone who was a perfect, pious man, and he was not. The man who was born blind experienced initial infatuation with Jesus. And that's very much to be expected. If someone heals you from blindness, you are totally in love with them. But then the Jewish authorities explained to him, did you think about it, what happened? He spat on the ground, made clay, and put on your eyes, and all of this happened on a Saturday. And Saturday, the day of the Sabbath, for good Orthodox Jews, is a day when you do not perform any manual labor, period. If you know good Orthodox Jews, they won't even touch the buttons on the elevator on a Saturday because it's manual labor. You are not supposed to do anything of that sort on the Sabbath day. It is one of the 10 Commandments. It's right there in the Decalogue. It's not one of those minuscule 555 6.7 rules. It's one of the 10 Commandments. It was and still is a defining characteristic of what it means to be a Jew. On Saturday, you don't work. And so the authorities, let's call them canon lawyers of the first century, point out to this blind man, do you realize what happened? The law says, on a Sabbath day, thou shalt not perform any manual labor. You, sir, just stated that he spat on the ground, made clay with his own hand, put on your eyes. Hence he broke the commandment, ergo he is not a good Jew. Case closed, guilty. Yep, Jesus was not a good Jew. He broke one of 10 commandments. So this poor man has to evaluate, what does he think about Jesus? Does he acknowledge his gratitude, his devotion, his relationship with Jesus, despite the fact that he is a sinner, despite the fact that it was just proved to him, black and white, that he broke one of 10 commandments? Or should he acknowledge the fact that a sinner cannot be from God? So after a moment of reflection, the ex-blind man says, if he is a sinner, I do not know. But what I do know is that I was blind and now I see. That's simple. I don't know if he is a sinner. You say he is, but you know what? Who knows? But what I do know is that I was blind and now I see. And that's what many of us realize when we think of our relationships with your husband, with your wife, with your boyfriend, girlfriend. There is a time when you realize that perhaps she is a sinner. Perhaps he is not so perfect. Perhaps he gave you 1 or 2 gray hairs. Perhaps. But there was something there that made you feel like you can see all of a sudden. He or she grabbed you by your heart and changed your life totally. And that moment, that transformation from blindness to being able to see is worthwhile saying, I don't know if he's perfect. I don't know if she's perfect, but what I do know, that she made my life so much more complete. That he makes my life so much more complete. And some couples survive that moment of crisis, that moment of truth. Some couples don't. The same can be said about communities, perhaps even about churches. When I meet with people before the wedding, I always encourage them to shop around for a church. Because when there is a baby or babies coming around eventually, I tell them, you will want to have a home church. You will want to have a community which will embrace you, a community in which you can feel at home. And I tell them, this is America. Go to this church, that church, find out which one fits you most, which one you can identify with, and which one also will challenge you to be better. So there is nothing wrong with shopping around for a good church. And we have visitors who come and go, and we have visitors who come and stay. That's a healthy, normal part of the process. But once you find that church, for the first few months, or perhaps for the first year or two, everything about the church makes you so happy. The music is heavenly, the priest is cute, your neighbors smell great, everything is just perfect. But give it some time, and the priest drives you crazy, the sermons are too long, your neighbors didn't shower one Sunday, and eventually you keep asking yourself, this church is not perfect. This congregation is nuts. I'm not sure I belong here. And so, again, it's a healthy process. When people realize that that church they were so infatuated with is, after all, not perfect, it can be a moment of transformation and confirmation. It can be a moment like in the gospel today when people say, I don't know if this church is perfect. I know that priests ain't perfect. But what I do know is that I was blind and now I see. What I do know that my life was incomplete and now it makes sense. Is it perfect? No. Will it ever be perfect? Ask yourself, will your husband be ever perfect? Will your wife be ever totally flawless? Impossible. But if there was a moment in your life when your wife, when your husband, when your church grabbed you by your heart and made you feel like, now I can see, now my life makes perfect sense, that moment, that experience is worth saying, I will stay around. I will keep coming here. I will keep being his husband, her husband, keep being his wife. I can do that because I was blind and now I see. Our offertory hymn today will be Amazing Grace. And a part of that first verse is, I was blind and now I see. And every time I celebrate a wedding, I think to myself, this is amazing. This is an amazing grace that two people are crazy enough, knowing that they are imperfect, that they are crazy enough to do that. What an amazing grace it is. When I come to this church, and I know that you know that I am very much imperfect, and I know that I can drive you crazy more often than not, I say to myself, this is an amazing grace. This is something spiritual. This is something magical. When I look at all kinds of couples who have been together 5, 10, 20, 50, 60 years, I say to myself, what an amazing grace that people, despite having experienced each other's shortcomings and failures, choose to remain together. What an amazing grace. And that grace comes from the moment that I hope each one of us can say, I don't know if this is a perfect situation, but I do know that I was blind and now I see.